that literature has expanded considerably. So particulate matter is one of those things that factors into air quality and into asthma and other types of health effects. And so we're pushing that number now. That literature is going up into the millions of dollars per ton at this point. So that changes quite considerably. But again, when I actually took that into account in this study, it had very little impact on the results, right? And so that does question, are we actually conducting these studies properly enough that we're actually eliciting people's values? Or are we at a point where these types of impacts just can't be monetized in this way? It's not going to help the decision-making process, and so that's sort of something that we need to think about when we're looking at doing this. I just quickly wanted to look at some of the sensitivity analysis because, again, life cycle assessment isn't to get one-point estimate for significant figures and things like that. It is to look at trade-offs between these things. And so one of the things I looked at was the length of the project that you're actually looking at. And this gets to not just whether you're doing Wyoming to a shorter distance, but it also looks at the level of infrastructure that you would require. So the amount of rail that you would require changes the results quite considerably. So this orange is the rail, and you can see that the costs associated with the rail system come down very quickly as you decrease the length. And I did a bunch of studies on the level of congestion for the rail systems, and what I found was that there was some capacity to add to the rail traffic, but there was also opportunities to sort of triple and quadruple tracks in the corridor to alleviate the congestion. So you didn't have to build the full rail system even if there was some congestion. Conversely, the transmission system, as you start loading the lines, you get more losses. And so you would likely not load beyond what the base case was. And so as you need to add more capacity, so as you increase the size of the project, you then start having to build additional transmission systems every time. So the economies of scale for the transmission system are much smaller than the rail system that was there. And so you can see that, as I said, the rail system comes down considerably. You can see here was the crossover point, so at about 500 to 600 miles was when you would cross over from AC to DC. And then this rail, or the pipeline and the synthetic natural gas actually does become competitive at shorter distances, as well that the coal to gas by wire actually also is competitive at the higher end. And then the size of the system. So the last, after this study was published, actually, California announced a memorandum of understanding with Wyoming that they were actually going to try and get some of this coal energy into California. And they were proposing 12 gigawatts of power. So I was looking at 1 gigawatt. So the base case here was this 1 gigawatt. They were proposing 12 gigawatts of power to go forward. And so the size of the project also influences this. And you can see that as you get up to larger amounts of energy, that the coal to gas by pipeline actually becomes the preferred option. And that's because the economies of scale of the pipeline are actually much better than the economies of scale for even the rail system, but much more than the transmission system. So that was something that came out of this, and at that time, natural gas prices were quite high, and so there were natural gas plants that were not being utilized and pipelines that were not being utilized because of the price of gas. And so this was a good opportunity at that time. Things have now changed, so it would be less competitive, but it definitely was at that time. Any other questions and comments? No? One of the things, unquantified issues. So in life cycle assessment, a lot of times there are things you just can't quantify. So I talked about this valuation exercise and the fact that actually trying to value it and put a dollar value on some of these emissions might not be the best way to go. But there's also other issues that are just very difficult to quantify. So we did talk about siting the power plants themselves, as well as the transport infrastructure. So I had sort of neglected that and assumed that it would be just as difficult to site each one. But that's very different. The pipeline, if you're, we're talking about the pipeline for the Keystone right now, but the natural gas pipelines, if you're putting them underground, tend to be less difficult to site than a transmission line, which is very visible and that kind of thing. The local versus regional versus global impact, so we talked about that a little bit. One was using the waste heat, but the other is this fact that the sulfur dioxide and the particulate matter and NOx are very much local effects. Versus greenhouse gas emissions, which are much more global. And I didn't distinguish between those things. I just tried to take the value associated with each of those, and so that's an unquantified issue. The other thing is employment. So at the political level, jobs are always in the discussion. So the Keystone discussion is a lot of times brought back to the jobs that would be available. and that I didn't look at, but that the employment associated with this, even though Wyoming has a small population, still might be politically something that would be sellable, as well as in Texas. The last thing is just the equity issue. So power generation impacts that are incurred by people that are not consuming the electricity. And this, I think, is a pretty big issue in Alberta as well, is that if you're going to generate electricity and you're not getting the benefit from it, but you're getting the local impacts from it, that can be a different issue than if you're actually generating the electricity for your own use. So that's another issue that I didn't necessarily quantify, but it was something that if I was taking this to a decision maker, I'd want to highlight the fact that they need to consider that as well. Maybe not from a quantitative perspective, but at least to talk to people and understand this as they go forward. The last thing is the alternatives that I looked at as well. So I looked at 4 different options, but there are other options as well. So the coal slurry pipeline, so actually mixing it with water and using it in the pipeline, they have a big project that is doing that already. And that does look good from a cost perspective. The political reality of actually getting that built is difficult though. The AC transmission we talked about, the high temperature superconductor, so that can very much address the losses, reduce the amount of energy that is required, but it's a very costly technology. So, for 1,000 miles, it's unlikely that you would ever invest in that. But if that cost did come down over time, then that might be something you factor in. Barge and rail, and then combined heat and power, as we talked about, is another option that you could try to make use of that waste heat as well in the system. So I'll leave it here with the small amount of additional energy. The result then is that you add to the current rail shipments. But if no rail capacity exists, then the mine mouth generation using the transmission system would be the cheaper option to use. But as you get above the 9 gigawatts of power, it's actually cheaper to build a new rail system. But the gasification system was also quite attractive at that level of power as well. But when you're looking at the shipping of coal, gas, or electricity, the key components that you need to look at are the distance that you're actually shipping the energy, the capacity of the infrastructure that's already in place, and the energy the amount of energy that you want to be shipping. The social costs, as I said, do not change the recommendation, but internalizing them helps to sort of support the rail versus the transmission system. And I'll just, any of the last comments on that study? Hopefully it gave you a flavor of the way that you could use life cycle assessment and the type of decision. You saw that I didn't come out and say unequivocally one option was better than the other. Instead I was saying, here are the things you need to think about when you look at these, and this is what the trade-offs are associated with these different types of options. And I'll just leave you with that the life cycle assessment can be a very powerful and flexible decision-making tool. And that I would suggest that you'd want to take that sort of life cycle thinking and apply it to any type of decision or design process that you go through. But there are a few words of caution, so that it's helpful to answer some questions rather than others. So appropriately using it is important. Using your intuition to try and help decide things like how much detail to get into and things like that can be dangerous. So you want to actually do some of the calculations associated with it. Pay close attention to the data quality and the consistency. So when you're reading a life cycle study, those are the types of things that you should look for, is where they got the data, how they're making their assumptions and things like that. Be careful in interpreting the results. Don't confuse values with science, so make sure that if you're doing the analysis itself, that you're not imposing your own values on that. I think that's sort of a general rule to follow. And then the uncertainty, we didn't get into it too much, but that, you have to use it appropriately in terms of answering the trade-off question, as opposed to taking a study like this and say, okay, now I'm going to build this transmission system based on the design specs that are in this study. That's not what it's intended to be used for. So I'll thank you for your attention. It was fun to talk to you. And if you have any further questions after this, I'd be happy to follow up and talk with you about it.
All right, well, I just want to thank you very much for coming in. This is for you. We're going to take a quick break now. So 10 minutes or so if you guys want to use the washroom or grab some more food at the back and coffee. And then we'll reconvene at 11 for our next speaker. So thanks again for coming in.